In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Christos voskras. I really like nature programs about animals. And I think I get this from my dad. My dad was a big fan of, watching those programs about, lions or tigers or different animals in the wild, if you will. And so, like many people, of course, those are readily accessible these days on YouTube or on Netflix. And so I've spent, the last few weeks, every now and then, watching a program about animals. And lo and behold, I came across one which I thought was quite intriguing. It's called The Tiger King. And so I was excited because it seemed that it was, there were lions and tigers in the advertising for the program. So I began to watch The Tiger King. And surprisingly, it wasn't really about tigers and lions, even though lions and tigers were in the program. But it actually, what it focuses on more is on this one character named Joe Exotic. And I thought, after watching one episode, well, maybe they'll focus more on the lions and tigers, and instead the program goes down a dark, dark road. And Joe Exotic is quite the character. It's not perhaps something for the faint of heart. But one thing about that program is that, and that I discovered, is that it's what underlies the whole program, and particularly the main character and those who he encounters in his work, is about trust and how difficult it is for us to trust others and how fragile our trust can be at the best of times. The subject of trust, or rather a lack of trust, and it fills the headlines these days, right? How do we tell the good guys from the bad guys? How do we know who is trustworthy and who is not? How do we know who is infected and who is not? And there are no easy answers. And sometimes the people we believed we could trust most, they let us down. Thomas, the disciple, seems to share our predicament as human beings and our ambivalence with respect to trust. If I asked you to tell me what you know about Thomas in the Bible, you'd likely say, well, that's the doubting Thomas, because many of us have been taught to call this story the story of doubting Thomas. And this expression is often meant more as an indictment than a compliment. It's certainly not flattering to be called a doubting Thomas. But I think it's important for us to remember that doubt is not the opposite of faith. Rather, it's essential to faith. And I would even say that it's a sign of real engagement, of commitment. Maybe this surprises you, that those of us with a lot of uncertainty are actually the faithful. English translations of this gospel passage often use the word doubt. And it's for the Greek word apistos. Apistos is the opposite of pistos, oddly enough, kind of like asymmetry or symmetry. And the primary meaning of pistos is trust. So pistos is without trust. And in this passage, the Greek verb that's used, is become. And the command that Jesus gives here is not about skepticism or doubt. Rather, he's talking about what he's commanding us and inviting us to, and Thomas particularly, is about becoming untrusting versus trusting. Jesus says, in fact, we could translate it, do not become untrusting, but trusting. Become trusting. A few years ago, I encountered a student who was searching for a faith community. And she had searched in a variety of places in Judaism and a variety of Christian communities and denominations. And so I invited her to come to church with me, and she did. Over time, she began to actually get more involved in the university parish where I was working. And she felt that she was welcome to attend services and participate in the life of the community, even though she wasn't a Christian herself. And in time, she joined our rite of Christian initiation for adults, preparing to become Catholic. And I'll never forget the meeting that we had right after Easter that one year. As part of the introduction to the material, I asked each person in the room to share what they thought about the resurrection of Jesus and what it meant to them. And one by one, each person told what they thought about the meaning of resurrection and what they think happened after Jesus' death and crucifixion. Well, after the meeting, my friend pulled me aside and said, incredulously, she said, "No one believes in the resurrection. I thought to be a Christian, you had to believe in the resurrection." "Well, we do," I said. "Christians believe in the resurrection. It's the heart of our faith." And she said, "Well, no one in that room said that they believed that the physical body of Jesus was alive after it had been dead." I said, "Well, that's resuscitation. That's not resurrection." So remember, brothers and sisters, that trusting in resurrection is not about belief in resuscitation of a corpse. It's about something completely different. Trusting in resurrection is faith. Not certainty, but faith. That God vindicated Jesus after his crucifixion. That Jesus' life and his work was not for naught, and it did not end with his death. Trusting in resurrection is an assertion that Jesus lives and that Jesus is Lord. That the love and life of God is bigger than death, even the most brutal of executions. That's the message that all the resurrection accounts have in common. The evidence of trusting the resurrection of Jesus is the continual coming into being of the church. It's not the other way around. And in the gospel today, Jesus tells Thomas, do not become untrusting, don't be untrusting, but trusting. Become trusting. And in response, Thomas utters the most complete and powerful confession in the whole gospel. My Lord and my God. Thomas confesses to seeing God revealed in Jesus, not because he has touched Jesus, but because Jesus has graciously offered himself to him. Jesus gives Thomas what he needs for faith. And so ultimately, this is a story about accepting what God freely offers us and gives us and what we sorely need most of the time, but particularly in these days. And so we can imagine ourselves as being like Thomas, long on demands and short on trust. That's not hard. But if we focus on Thomas, we risk losing track of the center of this story. The center of this story is Jesus, not Thomas. And it's a story of hope and promise, not of judgment and reprimand. This is a story about experiencing the grace of God in Jesus Christ, without limit and without measure. This is a story about Jesus breathing new life into a community of faith in the midst of grief and fear. This is a story of reassurance about Jesus repeatedly making himself available to his followers, those who saw him, and even those who did not see him. And so in these days of waiting, like Thomas, who waited a whole week to encounter the risen Jesus, perhaps you're asking, God, what is taking you so long? Where are you these days? During these days of waiting, God, remember, is preparing us for his promise. During our waiting, he's teaching us things, teaching perhaps things about yourself that you never knew before. He's growing our character, our faith, and our ability to do what we feel called to do, especially, once life gets back to normal. In fact, God, we could say, is leading us through a process. The question is, will you and I trust the process? Christos Voskras.